Arriving late to the groom's funeral, she asked to have the coffin opened for a farewell. But as soon as they lifted the lid, the bride recoiled as if stung. Angela sat on a bench near the window, unable to calm herself down. Just as she began to think that she couldn't possibly cry anymore, tears poured from her eyes with even greater force. She was scared, bewildered, devastated, and utterly clueless about what to do next, and frankly, what was happening at all. Just a few minutes ago, she had everything a simple country girl could dream of: a solid home, a somewhat decent job, bringing in a modest but stable income, and the love of her life, whom she was planning to marry soon. Now, the last item on that list seemed lost to Angela, irreversibly so it seemed at the time. Just half an hour ago, a stranger called her and informed her that her Jacob was no longer alive. The entire conversation felt like a terrible nightmare, yet its details were seared into her memory. "Hello, am I speaking with Angela Russell?" "Yes, this is she." "Do you know Jacob Lewis?" "He's my fiancé. What's happened? Has something happened?" At that moment of the conversation, Angela felt a slight unease. She didn't like the formal address or the use of full names. Something was off. A foreboding feeling enveloped her entire being. "I'm calling from City Hospital number 20. I've been authorized to inform you that Jacob Lewis passed away in our facility tonight. Upon admission, he provided your contact information. You need to come to our clinic for identification by tomorrow noon." The woman spoke mechanically, as if she were a robot, an artificial intelligence rather than a human. Angela even had the feeling that she was simply reading off a piece of paper, not fully grasping the meaning of what she was saying. Because of this, it took her a moment to fully comprehend what she had just heard. She was about to say something neutrally polite, bid farewell, and hang up, when the horrifying meaning of the words she had just heard finally reached her consciousness. For a while, she just gasped for air, trying to cope with the overwhelming emotions flooding over her. The stranger on the other end of the line remained silent, evidently patiently waiting for Angela to confirm her attendance at the appointed time to identify her fiancé's body. Instead, she asked, "How did he die? What happened?" "Well, if you were unaware, miss," the medical worker replied with a hint of annoyance, "it's medical confidentiality which I'm not entitled to disclose. Stop wasting my time. I have plenty of work besides you. Will you come for identification or not?" "Yes," Angela replied weakly. "Of course I'll come." As soon as she heard her response, the stranger hung up. It seemed that nothing else concerned her. Strange people were entrusted in this hospital to inform others of the death of their loved ones. Angela wasn't an expert on the matter, but somehow she was sure this wasn't how it was supposed to be done. And overall, this whole situation seemed rather strange. What other health issues? From where? Jacob, as far as she knew, had never complained about anything in particular. He was a sturdy, strong man, and suddenly there was an exacerbation of some serious illness, leading to a fatal outcome. Moreover, just a few days ago, he was talking to Angela on the phone. His voice was lively, cheerful, clearly not resembling that of someone seriously ill. Besides, right after that, he was supposed to go on a business trip to another city. And yet, he ended up in the hospital for some reason, without even informing her about it. Angela even briefly considered if there might be some criminal involvement, but she quickly dismissed that thought. Her fiancé was just an ordinary sales representative in a rather small company. He usually didn't even carry much cash with him, except for petty expenses. Plus, it would be strange if the clinic staff confused a chronic condition with some injury. In general, the situation was as unclear as it was unexpected. For the rest of the day, thankfully a day off, Angela could only bitterly cry by the window, or in moments of clarity, ponder how inexplicable it all was. The next day was expected to be no less difficult. To get to the city by noon, she had to get up at an ungodly hour. However, this wasn't a big problem for a country girl, but every trip beyond her hometown always became a major stress for her. Amidst the preparations and accompanying worries, Angela didn't immediately remember what terrible reason forced her to leave abruptly. Then she again thought about how strange and incomprehensible everything was. On her way to the morgue, she thought about something she hadn't considered the day before. It must be some kind of mistake. Well, of course, that would perfectly explain all the oddities and inaccuracies, some absurd coincidence. It wasn't her fiancé lying cold and silent in the city hospital. They simply mixed him up with someone else. They called her, panicked her. But nothing. Soon she would arrive, and everything would be cleared up. This thought might not have been the smartest or, truth be told, the most decent. After all, it meant that Angela was relieved by the death of someone entirely unknown to her. Nevertheless, it gave her hope and strength to still make it to the morgue. However, as soon as she saw her fiancé's body, she realized that there was no mistake. It was really him. There couldn't be any doubt about it. She recognized him at first glance. How could she not recognize her beloved? He lay before her just like he was alive. It seemed like if she reached out her hand and touched him, he would immediately wake up. And Angela reached out. "Hey lady, that's not necessary," she heard a stern male voice behind her. And before she could understand anything, she received a not strong, but quite sensitive blow to her hand. In dismay, she turned around to see a paramedic standing there, smirking and wagging his finger at her. With each passing minute, the situation became more and more unpleasant, although it seemed like it couldn't get any worse. "It's not allowed to touch the deceased with your hands, sorry," he said roughly. I didn't know," Angela mumbled, flustered. She was thrown off balance. All tears, it seemed, had been shed the day before, and now there was only a deep, melancholy confusion and complete misunderstanding of what to do next. How would she be alone now? And besides, something had to be done with the body. "Listen," she addressed the paramedic, overcoming her aversion. "What's next?" "Understandably, thank God, I've never had to bury anyone. I don't even know where to start with it." "And you shouldn't be getting involved anyway," the man startled her. "It's all been taken care of. His cousin's sister will handle the funeral." "What sister?" Angela was taken aback. "He doesn't have anyone. He never mentioned any sister to me." "How would I know which sister?" The attendant snorted. "She came this morning, said she'll take care of everything related to the funeral. That's all I know. And anyway, there's nothing for you to do here. You've done your part." Angela had no choice but to turn and leave. Her bewilderment was so great that it almost overshadowed the horror and pain of losing her beloved husband. With each new turn, this whole situation became even stranger. Hundreds of questions swirled in her head, with nowhere to find answers. Angela walked through the hospital corridor, still not understanding what to do now. If this mysterious sister had decided to take care of the funeral, she probably should contact her, offer her help, or at least find out where and when her fiancé would find his final resting place. Whether from all these thoughts or from stress, Angela suddenly felt dizzy. She realized that if she took another step, she would inevitably fall. Waiting for the sudden weakness to pass, she leaned her back against the nearest wall. And at that moment she overheard voices muffled by a thin partition. One of them clearly belonged to the same attendant who accompanied her during the identification. "And she didn't suspect anything," one of them asked. "Didn't even have any doubts?" "No, fool is a fool, though for a moment I thought she understood." "Not surprising, I told you. Disguise him better, like a real corpse. He lies there looking alive. Lucky she apparently never saw dead bodies." Angela grabbed her head. What on earth is going on here? What has her late fiancé gotten himself into? And what about these strange attendants who are having even more cryptic conversations? What had she done so wrong that her peaceful, steady life suddenly turned into a not-so-quality horror movie? Her first impulse was to immediately return to the morgue and demand explanations. However, she didn't. After all, maybe they weren't talking about her, discussing some work-related matters, and she just heard a tiny part of the conversation. Not understanding the context and all, in that case, attempting to confront them would just look foolish and pitiful. However, even if the conversation did involve her and Jacob, who would tell her the truth? Certainly not the people who just moments ago practically pushed her away to prevent her from touching her fiancé's body. But maybe she could clarify something through that very sister. If only she knew how to find her. Continuing to replay all the oddities accompanying her fiancé's death in her head endlessly, Angela didn't even notice how she reached her own home, as if her body was controlled by some autopilot instead of herself, which safely brought her to her destination without incidents and then only switched off. But at home she didn't feel any calmer. Not knowing what to do, she struggled with one thing, then another, then a third, but almost immediately abandoned everything, unable to focus on anything. With horror, Angela thought about having to go to work the next day. Taking care of horses, of course, wasn't a difficult task, but in such a state, she might accidentally do something wrong and rightfully receive a kick to the forehead. After hesitating for a moment, the girl finally decided to call her boss and explain the situation. Fortunately, the man turned out to be understanding. As soon as he heard about Jacob's death, he said, "Don't worry, Angela, take your time to recover. Someone will cover for you. I understand what you're going through, and let me tell you, as someone experienced, it's better not to approach a beast in such a state, even if it's just a horse. So will you give me some time off?" she clarified, just to be sure. "Yes, take a week or two if needed. Get yourself together, attend the funeral, and then come back when you're ready." Thanking her boss warmly, Angela hung up. The rest of the day, she just wandered aimlessly around her own house. Sometimes she vigorously wiped non-existent dust from the shelves, and then suddenly burst into bitter tears, cursing her fate. Eventually, she fell asleep on the bench by the window, without even undressing. She woke up early in the morning and for a while couldn't understand why. Then, finally, she realized that she had been hearing persistent knocking on the door for several minutes. Wondering who could it be at such an hour, she went to open it. Standing on the doorstep was a young, well-groomed, clearly urban girl. "Angela," she exclaimed as soon as the door opened. "I'm sorry, do we know each other?" Angela was surprised. Angela was absolutely sure she had never seen this girl before. And where could they have met? Just by the look of the uninvited guest, it was clear that they belonged to completely different worlds. "Oh yes, you don't know me. I'm Helen, Jacob's cousin. Such a tragedy. He was so young." Angela noted that the girl didn't seem particularly upset. On the contrary, it seemed she had to make significant efforts not to smile broadly. The homeowner frowned. She didn't like the stranger at all, and certainly didn't trust her. "Yes," she said, "the morgue attendant mentioned you, but I don't understand why Jacob never mentioned he had a cousin." "To be honest, we were never very close," the girl replied without hesitation. "We didn't fight or anything. We just talked occasionally. So, I guess he didn't mention it. There was no reason. And I live far away from here, almost on the other side of the country, but as soon as I heard the news about my little brother's death, I rushed here, of course." Angela stopped understanding anything altogether. As far as she knew, Jacob was an orphan. He never mentioned any relatives, close or distant. But even if this girl was indeed his cousin, there was a logical question. How did she find out about what happened? If Angela were in a more rational state, she would have noticed another inconsistency. They and Jacob were never particularly close, and they only communicated occasionally, but suddenly, for some reason, he became a beloved brother upon hearing whose death you had to drop everything and fly to him across the country. "And is it even possible to get here so quickly from the other end of the country? I was told that you would take care of organizing the funeral," Angela managed to say. "Oh yes, of course, I think there's no need to burden the grieving bride with that. Besides, I have almost everything ready already. Most likely the funeral will be tomorrow." So soon? Angela was surprised. She didn't understand much about organizing funerals, but it seemed to her that it should take more time. And here was such promptness, as if Helen was afraid that her cousin might not be admitted to the heavenly garden because of being late. What was the rush for? Angela simply couldn't understand. "Why delay?" Helen scoffed. "You know what they say, long farewells, unnecessary tears and all that." "Maybe you need some help?" Angela continued to inquire. She didn't believe that girl for a second, although she couldn't quite explain to herself what the catch was. Her brain refused to function adequately in a critical situation, but her intuition was screaming that something wasn't right. However, Angela had no idea what to do about it or how to behave in such circumstances. "Come on," Helen kept chattering in the meantime. "I'm telling you, I've almost got everything ready. There's nothing to worry about. You know what? I wouldn't even advise you to come to the funeral itself. What's the point? Unnecessary stress, God forbid you feel unwell right there at the cemetery. It'll turn into some really bad joke. You better wait a little, rest, I'll handle everything. And then you can come to the grave later, if you want. Bring some flowers or whatever." "Yes," Angela replied bewilderedly. "You're probably right, I'm really not in the best condition right now." "That's it," Helen responded, oddly smiling. "Well, now that we've sorted everything out, I'll be off. It's time for me to go. Maybe we'll see each other again." What exactly they had sorted out, Angela never understood. From her perspective, the whole visit seemed very strange. Everything Helen said could have been discussed over the phone eventually. Why rush to the countryside, especially so early in the morning? What did this so-called groom's sister want from her anyway? Nothing was clear. At first, Angela really thought she shouldn't go to the funeral. What would she do there anyway? Watch the pale Jacob in the coffin. It might make her feel really sick, especially since she was terribly afraid of dead bodies. During the identification, when her blood was filled with adrenaline, Angela didn't even remember this fact, but now she understood. She was unlikely to be so lucky a second time. However, on the day of the funeral, she, not fully aware of what she was doing, started preparing for the trip to the city early in the morning, as if some unknown force was pulling and pushing her at the same time, as if something was telling her that she absolutely had to go to the cemetery, not someday later, but today. True, no matter how much Angela rushed when she arrived at the supposed place of the funeral, she realized she was late. Or maybe it was, because no one had come to accompany Jacob on his final journey. Either way, she found only gravediggers at the cemetery, getting ready to lower the coffin into the freshly dug grave. "Wait!" she unexpectedly called out to them, even surprising herself. The men paused their work and stared curiously at the new participant who appeared at the funeral. Angela approached them closely and asked in a quieter voice, "You're burying Jacob Lewis, aren't you?" "That's right," one of them readily agreed. "Poor guy, besides his sister. No one else came for him, but at least she didn't offend us." He pointed eloquently to a package nearby. Angela didn't quite understand what it was filled with, but she saw several bottlenecks sticking out from the top. It dawned on her that the gravediggers were already slightly tipsy. She didn't pay much attention to it. After all, their job wouldn't likely harm anyone. "Well, you see, I came too," she replied, flustered. "Looks like I'm late, and this is my fiancé." "Yes," sighed the same man. "It turned out badly, but I don't think he'll mind you." "Oh, excuse me, miss. It's an unsuccessful joke, of course, but you understand. The job leaves its mark." "I understand," Angela replied. "Listen, maybe you'll let me take a look at him, just for a moment to say goodbye." The gravediggers glanced at each other, probably considering whether this would be too serious a violation of the instructions. However, they were in a good mood, especially considering that the deceased sister had generously rewarded them. Besides, the client clearly wasn't in a hurry and wouldn't complain to anyone about them. "Why not go ahead, take a look?" one of them replied. "We all understand." Angela approached the coffin in confusion and placed her hands on its lid. She herself wasn't sure anymore about the correctness of her impulse. The request to have one last look at her fiancé had somehow burst out of her spontaneously. And now she wasn't too sure if she was ready for it, but there was no turning back. It would be foolish to ask permission to say goodbye to Jacob and then immediately backtrack, saying, "Okay, I changed my mind, bury him like this," seemed absurd and ridiculous. And so, taking a deep breath, Angela finally pushed open the coffin lid. She took a moment to gather herself before lowering her gaze. Then, finally, she looked at the person lying in the coffin. She sharply exhaled, recoiled, and even seemed to scream. And it wasn't because she remembered her fear of dead people at the most inappropriate moment. It was simply because the man before her wasn't her fiancé. "That's not him," she whispered in shock. But it must have come out so quietly that no one heard her. One of the gravediggers approached her and paternalistically placed a hand on her shoulder. "Easy, easy, dear," he said. "I understand how hard it is for you, but it's all right. Let's bury him, and you'll feel better. And do you want a sip of something strong? It helps. George, bring the lady a bottle." "I don't drink," Angela croaked, "and this one, in the coffin, is not my fiancé. You're burying the wrong person. This isn't Jacob. Where is Jacob? I need to see him." Tears streamed down the girl's cheeks. She didn't even realize how her words turned into a panicked scream, a cry of desperation. The new discovery shook her to the core. This whole situation had been extremely confusing from the very beginning. And now this, a stranger in the coffin instead of her beloved and dear Jacob. Her psyche simply couldn't handle this final blow. Meanwhile, the gravediggers looked at her in confusion, not knowing what to do next, whether to try to calm the unhappy woman or to report what had happened to someone else. After all, having the wrong deceased in the coffin was disorderly, if not downright criminal. On the other hand, what if the bride, grieving for her fiancé, simply lost her mind from grief, and the dead person was perfectly fine? They never came to any decision. For about 15 minutes, the scene in the cemetery remained unchanged. Angela was in hysterics. The gravediggers stood frozen, watching her, and who knows how long it would have continued, and how it would have ended if not for another frightening surprise. The deceased, who until that moment, as was proper, had been peacefully lying in the coffin, opened his eyes and sat up. At this point, even the gravediggers were on the verge of hysteria. They had certainly seen a lot in their lifetime, but they had never dealt with living dead people, or worse yet, essentially being accomplices to a crime and burying a person alive, which, apparently, was about to happen now. But, fortunately, Angela appeared. Her sudden desire to bid farewell to her deceased fiancé saved another person's life, because while she was talking to the gravediggers, while she was gathering the courage to open the coffin, and while in the end she was panicking and crying upon discovering it, wasn't Jacob enough time had passed for the stranger to regain consciousness? What's going on here?" he asked, looking around in astonishment. In short, one of the gravediggers, catching his breath, replied, "You, buddy, are one lucky guy. It seems you were nearly buried alive instead of someone else, but thanks to this kind lady who's now crying next to the coffin, that didn't happen." "Oh, I always knew people couldn't be trusted. It never leads to anything good," he sighed. What do you mean?" Angela asked, slightly stuttering. "How did you end up in the coffin, do you remember?" "I don't remember, but I guess," he sighed. "I'm sort of a homeless person, you know. And then this lady came up to me, all dolled up. Glamorous, as they say. 'I want to help you,' she says. Well, I was surprised, to be honest, but you know I was really hungry and it was cold, and she either gave me some tea or something else, and then I woke up here. She must have drugged me." "Helen," Angela whispered. She had no doubt who this dolled-up lady was. Now all the strangeness that had accompanied this story from the beginning started to fall into place. A puzzle was gradually forming in her mind. Angela finally understood what had happened, but what was more important now was not this, but that she had apparently become a witness to a serious crime. "I'm sorry," the resurrected dead man spoke up. "Do you happen to have any headache pills? I have a terrible headache." "I don't think a pill will help," Angela sympathetically replied. "Who knows what that woman drugged you with? It must be the aftermath of poisoning. You should rest." "Well, maybe in this very coffin," the man smirked. "I don't think that's a good idea," Angela replied seriously. "But you know, I think you can come with me. I have a little house in the village. Modest, of course. Facilities outside, but still better than nothing." "Oh, it's a bit uncomfortable," the stranger protested. "I'll be embarrassing you and all. But then I won't have to search for you in every alley of the city, hoping you're still alive," Angela replied. "And by the way, I intend to report all of this to the police, and you'll be needed as a victim and a witness. And you too." Her last words were addressed to the gravediggers who were standing ready with shovels. Both of them vigorously nodded, expressing their agreement with what Angela had said. They themselves had been thinking about the same thing in the last few minutes. "What's your name, by the way?" Angela asked the vagrant, suddenly remembering she hadn't asked him that question. "Paul," he replied. They followed exactly what Angela had proposed. She helped Paul, very weak from poisoning, to reach her home, where she put him to sleep. The next few days passed like one continuous nightmare. The man seemed to be fighting for his life. Most of the time he either slept or rambled, only occasionally coming to his senses and asking for a sip of water. Once, Angela touched his forehead and realized he had a very high temperature. At her own risk, she gave him a fever reducer, and it seemed to help. At least it alleviated his suffering a little. Perhaps it would have been wise to call an ambulance and entrust Paul to the care of doctors. But this thought never crossed Angela's mind, completely preoccupied with other concerns. And he had no documents, so they might not have taken him anyway. With all the problems that had fallen on her fragile shoulders lately, she could barely think. So she took care of her unexpected tenant herself until he recovered. This happened 4 days later. Initially, Angela thought Paul was just experiencing another wave of consciousness, which would soon be replaced by another bout of pain and fever. But that didn't happen for several hours, and it became clear that the worst was over. He was still very weak, of course, but it was evident that he was starting to recover, and certainly his life was no longer in danger. The next day they both went to the local police station. The officer listened to their story very attentively, with undisguised interest. It seemed to him like reading an engaging detective novel, only with the added possibility of participating in the investigation himself. And one could understand him. It was unlikely that he had ever participated in anything more significant than breaking up drunken fights and calming down overly loud teenagers, who thought it was a good idea to blast music at full volume at 3 in the morning. And here was such a story with faked death, poisoning, and miraculous rescue from being buried alive. After listening to Angela's story in full, he asked her and Paul a series of clarifying questions. This included recording personal data of the missing fiancé and the phone numbers of those grave diggers. As they left the station, the officer assured them that he would put all possible efforts into the investigation. Angela hoped very much that they wouldn't delay in filing the report and that law enforcement would be able to find her imaginary fiancé and his accomplice. Now she was absolutely sure she wasn't his sister. It was painful to realize that she had been deceived so cunningly and cruelly. For some time, she had truly believed that Jacob was dead and had suffered unimaginable pain because of it. And now Angela understood the essence of this whole scheme completely. The thing was, shortly before his tragic demise, Jacob had taken out quite substantial sums from several banks and had also persuaded his fiancée to become a co-signer. Now it was obvious to her, in order to get more money. But then he had fed her a lot of nonsense about how all of this was necessary for organizing their future wedding and subsequent travels. Then he staged his death, leaving all these monstrous debts to his failed bride. Of course, this wasn't the main goal of the scheme because he didn't care whether the banks would get their money back or from whom. Angela's involvement was necessary to identify the body of the groom and, accordingly, to make his death look as convincing as possible, that's all. Now Jacob, along with his girlfriend and a huge sum of money, had disappeared in an unknown direction to live happily and peacefully, without any worries. Of course, Angela's feelings, who was supposed to consider him dead, didn't interest him in the slightest, and it seemed he didn't even know that things hadn't gone exactly as planned. For another week, Angela was absolutely sure that her former fiancé would soon face the harsh but fair hand of justice. The police officers working on the case seemed very interested in solving it as soon as possible, and when Angela finally called the officer, she was sure they would call her in again for identification, only this time not of a dead body, but of a captured criminal. "Hello, Angela, regarding your statement, are you available to talk?" "Yes, of course. Have you found them?" "Angela, I really hate to disappoint you, but no, we haven't found them, and frankly, I doubt we will. No evidence. Your fiancé obviously ditched his phone. Besides, the information you provided turned out to be fake. Apparently, he was using someone else's name and forged documents, so we don't even know yet who these people really are and what their names are." Angela's heart sank. "So what does this mean? Can't anything be done?" "Well, we've arrested 2 orderlies who were involved in this scheme. They're facing some time, though not much. Apparently, they didn't know much themselves. They were paid to stage this spectacle for you with the supposed dead body, but they weren't briefed on any details." It was difficult for Angela to cope with the betrayal and the fact that the criminals had managed to evade legal punishment. But despite all this, she needed to carry on. She returned to work, often picking up extra shifts. Firstly, it distracted her from the heavy thoughts, and secondly, she now had to pay off all the terrible debts left by her runaway fiancé, so the extra money came in handy. Meanwhile, Paul continued to live in her house. Initially, he refused and wanted to return to his former street life. However, Angela managed to convince him that he wasn't causing her any inconvenience. Quite the opposite. "I have a lot of repairs to be done around the house," she said, "and nobody else to do them. Not long ago, I thought someone would show up soon. But as you know, that didn't work out. So, if you're uncomfortable just living here, take care of the repairs. Consider it a kind of rent." "You're fearless," was all Paul could respond with. "Letting any random homeless guy into your house, especially after what happened to you." "I try not to think poorly of people," she smiled, and Angela never regretted her decision. Paul turned out to be a true jack-of-all-trades. He fixed absolutely everything in the house, including things that seemed beyond repair. He also helped out in the garden. Living with him was much easier than in proud solitude. A couple of months later, he unexpectedly left for the city, cryptically saying he had some business there. He returned a few hours later, literally beaming with happiness. It turned out he had gone for an interview at a factory, and they hired him. "I didn't want to jinx it by telling you in advance," he explained to Angela, "so you wouldn't be disappointed if it didn't work out. And now I can not only help you around the house, but also with money." "Why would you do that?" Angela was puzzled. "My situation isn't easy, but I can manage." "Why? Because not only do I live in your house, but you also saved me from death, a really horrible and unpleasant one at that. Besides, if it weren't for you, I wouldn't have gotten any job. When you're living on the streets, you just don't think about these things. So consider my help as a token of gratitude." Under the pressure of his arguments, Angela had to give in. Her life gradually improved, and after a couple of months she hardly remembered Jacob or his betrayal. She might have completely forgotten if it weren't for the regular payments on his loans, which, however, Paul now greatly helped her with. He turned out to be a pleasant man, intelligent, polite, considerate. There was always something to talk about with him. And anyway, she liked having someone around. Everything wasn't so sad and lonely anymore. So she herself didn't notice how their strange relationship turned first into friendship and then into something more. Weeks passed, and then months. The couple lived a simple but quite happy life, gradually leaving behind all worries and hardships. Everything bad that was in the past began to seem no more than a bad dream. Of course, money was a bit tight, but compared to everything else, it seemed trivial. The only thing that slightly troubled Angela was the worsening of her condition. She began to wake up heavily in the mornings, and in general she felt not very well. She occasionally had headaches, which had never happened before. Occasionally she felt nauseous. She, who had never complained about her health before, became concerned. Not immediately, of course. At first, she didn't pay attention to the worrying symptoms at all. Then she started to attribute them to stress or exhaustion from extra work. But the problems became more noticeable from week to week. Eventually, Angela reluctantly admitted to herself that it was time to visit a doctor. She didn't hide from Paul where she was going, and he, having had the day off, anxiously awaited her return. When Angela appeared on the doorstep of the house, he became even more worried. She looked so pale and upset. "What's wrong with you? Is it something serious? What did the doctor say?" he asked anxiously. "Well, how should I put it?" she mumbled vaguely. "It's actually very serious, but it's not an illness." "How did something else happen?" "Come on, don't keep me waiting. What is it? What's the problem?" "You see, Paul, I'm pregnant, and judging by the timing, well, not from you, but from that man whom I considered my fiancé." "That's it? Was it necessary to scare me like that, huh?" To Angela's surprise, Paul relaxed and smiled. It seemed that this news didn't affect him at all. If anything, he found it quite joyful. "Aren't you upset at all?" she cautiously asked. "And why should I be upset? Children are happiness. I always wanted to have a family, and now I will have a son or daughter. Isn't that great? Or are you worried that we won't be able to support them?" "I'm worried that it's not yours," Angela honestly said. "Paul, I understand if you don't have to raise someone else's child." "There are no strangers' children," he replied convincingly. "Listen, you didn't just pick him up somewhere on the side. In that case, I would have reason to worry, but as it is, anything can happen. I'm ready to fully accept this child and raise them as my own." At that moment, Angela felt a weight lift off her heart, and it seemed that at that moment, she truly felt that she loved Paul. And he evidently loved her, since he was willing to accept even a child from another man, especially considering that the biological father was clearly not the nicest person. And yet, this was a very pleasant discovery for her, and an indicator that this time she definitely didn't make a mistake in choosing a life partner. And they continued their happy, measured life, with the only difference being that now they also had to prepare for the arrival of the baby. They designated one of the rooms as a nursery, and gradually began to furnish it as they had some spare money. In her spare time, Angela read a lot about raising and educating children. She wanted to be the perfect mother. Paul, on the other hand, began to devote even more time to work, taking extra shifts, sometimes staying after work, which was well paid at their factory. He sought to earn more money so that their future child lacked nothing. Work was not a burden to him, especially since the team had become good and friendly. Everyone supported each other and provided assistance if needed. They all rejoiced in each other's successes. Learning that Paul was soon to have a child unexpectedly, they presented him with a gift at work. They chipped in and bought some trendy, fancy stroller. Therefore, when one of the colleagues came to work with a very gloomy expression on his face, everyone immediately rushed to find out what had happened and if they could help in any way. "Well, here's the thing," he said. "My wife is seriously ill. Sorry guys, I can't be more precise. I don't understand these medical matters." "But maybe there's something we can do," asked Paul. "Do you need medication or money for surgery?" "We need blood," he said, "for a transfusion. A specific blood type. Mine doesn't match. They've checked all the relatives too." "That's not a problem," Paul immediately responded. "Let's go where we need to donate. Maybe someone's will match. Right, guys?" They responded with an approving hum. Paul himself volunteered to go first, literally the next day. Fortunately, it was a day off. He went straight to the hospital in the morning. What's the point in waiting? And everything went quite smoothly. The nurse took his sample and left, asking Paul to wait in the office. He had to sit there for quite a while. Half an hour passed, then an hour. Paul began to suspect that something was wrong. Of course, he wasn't a specialist in such matters, but he assumed that a simple test shouldn't take that long. He was starting to get a little nervous when the door to the office finally opened. Contrary to expectations, it wasn't the nurse, but apparently some serious doctor, perhaps even the chief physician. At least, he looked very dignified. The thought flashed through Paul's mind that maybe his blood turned out to be suitable. This would explain the long wait and the fact that instead of the nurse, a doctor came to him. "You're Paul, right?" the man who entered clarified. "Yes, that's me," he confirmed, getting up to greet him. "It's better if you sit down," the man said. "I have some news for you that may seem strange and perhaps even unbelievable." "Just don't tell me you've examined my blood and found some terrible disease," Paul replied, half jokingly, half anxiously. No, as far as I can judge, you're healthy. It's not about that. Did you know you have a very rare blood type? It occurs in about 1 in a million. To be honest, I had no idea. Well, now you know, and this circumstance makes you, let's say, a potential missing child of an older couple. I don't understand, Paul honestly said. You see, they've been long-time clients of our clinic. They had a son, their only one, late in life and dearly beloved. But when he was little, someone kidnapped him from the playground, right under the nanny's nose. They never found the child and his fate remains unknown, but the parents haven't lost hope that he's alive and well. Of course, no police is looking for him anymore. It's too old a case. But that child should be about your age now. And he also had the same rare blood type. And those people I mentioned, his parents, asked us to pay attention to such patients as you. The chances, of course, are slim. We've had several such patients already, but alas, they turned out not to be the one. But what if you're the missing child? Understood, Paul shrugged. So what is required of me? Of course, the doctor cautiously continued. You're an adult and have the right to refuse the analysis that would definitively clarify everything, but both I and our clients would be very grateful if you agreed. Well, I don't have much to lose, Paul replied. You know, I was raised by an alcoholic mother. Constant beatings and humiliations and then life on the streets. So if it turns out she wasn't my real mother, I'd only be glad. Excellent, the doctor replied. Then I'll ask you to wait a couple more hours, and as soon as the results are ready, I'll inform you. To the immense surprise perhaps of all the participants in the process, it turned out that Paul was indeed the missing son of these people. Apparently, in his childhood, he was kidnapped by a mentally unstable woman who couldn't have children of her own. But now justice was restored, the family reunited. Moreover, it turned out that Paul's parents were very wealthy people, and now they wanted to give their beloved son everything he had been deprived of in the past years. They bought him and Angela a luxurious house, helped furnish it. In addition, Paul's father hired him at his company and began gradually teaching him everything necessary to eventually pass on the business to him. Paul asked them for one more favor. None of the factory workers had suitable blood for a transfusion for their colleague's wife. but it wouldn't be a problem for Paul's newfound parents to find a suitable donor, which they promptly did. Thus, the colleague's wife was saved. Finally, Paul felt confident. He stood firmly on his own feet and could give his family the very best. It was for this reason that he only now decided to propose to Angela, which she, of course, joyfully accepted. The couple had a magnificent wedding, and soon after their son was born. The family's life took a dramatic turn. They no longer had to work tirelessly to provide a decent living for themselves and their child. They quickly paid off the debts left by Jacob, and now nothing stood in the way of their happiness. Several years passed. Paul worked in his father's company and learned various business intricacies. Angela, on the other hand, took care of the household and raising their child, named Kevin. Both were absolutely content with this arrangement. In the spring of the same year, when their son was supposed to start school, another joyful event occurred in the family. Angela gave birth again, and this time it was twins. Of course, Paul raised their first son as his own, but he was still glad that they now had children who were truly theirs. The elder son didn't cause any trouble to his parents. On the contrary, Kevin delighted them with his successes at school and exemplary behavior. For finishing the first quarter with straight A's, Paul and Angela decided to get him a gift, a brand new tablet on which, among other things, he could practice drawing, a talent he clearly possessed. And then on one not-so-fine day, the boy came home from school upset and without his precious gift. Apparently, someone from his classmates noticed him taking out the tablet during break, got envious, and eventually decided to steal it from Kevin's backpack. The next day, Angela went to school, more precisely, straight to the principal's office. There, with the help of security and after reviewing the camera footage, they quickly identified the thief. The principal called his father and summoned him for a talk. Angela decided to wait for his arrival and talk to him personally before involving the police. If, of course, it came to that at all. She waited for about an hour, and then the door to the office opened and a man entered, holding his son's tablet. He wasn't too old yet, but most of the hair on his head was already grey, pale, gaunt, and clearly unwell. Nonetheless, Angela recognized him. Despite all the years that had passed and the toll that time had taken on him, it was Jacob. Obviously, he had also found out about his deceived fiancé. He stood there, looking at her with surprise, unable to utter a word. Angela regained her composure first and reached for her phone. Here he was, the liar, the cheat, and now, in all likelihood, a murderer. She was going to immediately report his whereabouts to the authorities. "Wait," Jacob finally spoke up. "I understand you're about to call the police, but—" "About to," she coldly replied. "You're a criminal, and you must answer for everything you've done." "I don't deny that, but please hear me out first. If after that you still think I deserve punishment, call. I won't hinder you. I won't run away. I promise. By the way, this should be yours." With these words, he handed Angela the tablet. She took it mechanically and looked Jacob straight in the eyes. Something in his gaze and voice made her postpone dialing the phone. "Okay," she said, "go on, I'm listening." "Well, you've probably already guessed that the girl who pretended to be my sister was actually my lover. We were young and very foolish, and Kate, her real name, was pregnant. We wanted to provide the child with as good a future as possible, so we came up with this idiotic plan. Of course, none of this justifies us. We thought everything went well. We didn't think about anyone else but ourselves. Like fools, we were happy that we managed to get a large sum of money and avoid responsibility. But our joy didn't last long at all. It soon turned out that Kate had serious health problems, which pregnancy, of course, only exacerbated. All the money ended up not on a luxurious life, but on trying to somehow support her health, help her carry our son. And in the end, she carried him, even gave birth, but she herself didn't survive all of this, died in childbirth. The boy was barely saved somehow, so I became a single father, without a wife, without a home, and essentially without means of subsistence. I barely managed to find any kind of work to be able to support myself and my son. Even now, we live very poorly, but still better than we did in the first years. Plus, as it turns out, I also have a chronic illness. Several years ago, I was diagnosed with diabetes, and it's quite severe. Now I'm on insulin, and honestly, I don't know how much longer I'll last. You know, I've thought a lot about all of this and came to the conclusion that it's karma or fate, whichever you prefer. In short, someone punished Kate and me for what we did, but at least, as I see it, things are going well for you. And you can't imagine how happy I am about that. It seems we didn't ruin your life, at least. That's for sure, Angela sighed. I'm doing just fine, and that poor guy you tried to bury alive is too. When Jacob heard this, his face brightened. Angela realized that he truly regretted his actions and had been agonizing over causing the terrible death of someone who had done him no harm. And now he understood that at least this sin wasn't on his conscience anymore. Realizing this, Angela made her decision. "All right, Paul and I are fine," she said, "and it seems life has truly punished you beyond measure. Besides, your guy didn't deserve to lose his father and end up in an orphanage because of you. But still, try to explain to him that theft leads to no good for his own sake." "Yeah," Jacob replied, "I'll try, believe me. I now know firsthand what happens to those who act like that. And you know, I have one more request if you'll allow me, although of course it might be too much to ask." "Curious, what is it?" Angela asked. When something happens to me, it's likely to be before he turns 18, please. Take care of him." "All right," said Angela, and happy she went home to her beloved husband and their beautiful children.